In 1989, Ted Turner bought 113,000 acres of dying Montana grassland and did something every neighboring rancher called insane. He tore down the fences. Not some of them, all of them. And then he brought in bison. What followed over the next 3 decades wasn't a conservation project in any traditional sense. It was something closer to a controlled demolition of the assumptions we had built around land, profit, and what it actually takes to bring a broken ecosystem back from the edge. Within 10 years, the grass had returned. Within 20, species that hadn't been recorded in that part of Montana for a century had started reappearing on their own. And the land that ranchers had written off as exhausted, the kind of ground that won't grow much of anything anymore, had quietly become one of the most biodiverse private properties in the American West. But that's not the part that surprised the researchers. What surprised them was a small depression in the earth, a wallow, the kind bison create when they roll in dry soil to shed parasites and regulate temperature, a behavior so ancient it predates the ranches, the homesteads, and everything we built over the top of this landscape, those wallows filled with rainwater. And in a place where cattle had compacted the soil so thoroughly that water barely penetrated the surface, those small, irregular ponds became the first standing water some of these acres had seen in decades. Life moved in almost immediately. Turner hadn't planned for any of this. No ecologist had modeled it. The bison simply did what bison had always done, and the land, it turned out, had been waiting. But the story of the Flying D Ranch isn't really about what 10 bison did to one piece of land. It's about what happened when that model scaled, across 2 million acres, 37 restaurant chains, and a direct confrontation with federal wildlife agencies that nearly unraveled everything. If you've been watching this series because you believe these stories matter, the ones that don't make the news cycle but quietly reshape entire ecosystems, hit like and subscribe. Every view tells the algorithm this kind of work is worth surfacing. It costs you nothing, and it keeps this research going. Because what Turner discovered next, and what it reveals about the only conservation model that might actually work at scale, that's where this story gets strange. Domestic cattle are creatures of habit. They return to the same ground, the same water sources, the same shade. Over years, that repetition has a physical consequence. Hooves compact the soil layer by layer until the structure underneath collapses. Water stops penetrating, roots suffocate, grasses thin, then disappear. The land doesn't announce this, it just quietly stops working. By 1989, the Flying D was a textbook case. Decades of intensive grazing had left the soil sealed. Streams ran warm and turbid. Native plant communities had been replaced by the kind of stubble that survives overuse rather than thrives in it. This wasn't neglect. This was the outcome of a system doing exactly what it was designed to do, at the expense of everything underneath it. The American grassland evolved over 10,000 years alongside an animal that moves. Bison herds graze hard and push on, giving the ground time to recover between passes. That rhythm, pressure, release, recovery is written into the soil's biology. Cattle don't move, and the land eventually reflects that. Turner understood this, at least intuitively. What he couldn't have known was precisely how the land would respond once the right animal returned to it. The bison didn't restore the Flying D gently. They grazed it hard, cropping grass to the root in dense patches, then pushing on. Their hooves, broader and more rounded than cattle's, worked the compacted surface differently. Where cattle hooves seal soil, bison hooves fracture it. Water began finding its way back underground. Dormant root systems started recovering. Within a few years, grasses that hadn't grown on this ground in decades were re-establishing themselves across the range. And then, something the researchers hadn't modeled. We described the wallows in the opening of this episode, those shallow depressions bison carve when they roll in dry soil. What the data began to show was how consequential they were at scale. Across the Flying D's 113,000 acres, hundreds of these depressions were collecting rainfall. On land where standing water had been absent for decades, these irregular ponds became nuclei for recovery. Amphibians, insects, migratory birds, life organized itself around water that hadn't been there a season earlier. A study tracking the ranch over 29 years, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, recorded the cumulative result. Plant diversity on the Flying D had doubled. If these stories of ecological restoration and the incredible resilience of nature matter to you, subscribe and join us as we continue to uncover how keystone species are reshaping the wild world around us. But the bison had only solved part of the problem. The grassland was recovering. What it still lacked was something with teeth, and getting that back would require a fight Turner didn't anticipate. Wolves don't file paperwork. But in the 1990s, Getting them back onto the American steppe required an enormous amount of it. As the Flying D recovered, predators began appearing at its edges. Wolves, functionally absent from Montana since federal extermination campaigns in the early 20th century, were filtering back south from Canada. Turner wanted them on his land. The political infrastructure around him was considerably less certain. The obstacle wasn't simply jurisdictional. Brucellosis, a bacterial disease present in Yellowstone's bison herds, had become the central legal lever used by livestock associations to resist any expansion of bison range. The argument was straightforward. Bison carrying brucellosis posed a transmission risk to neighboring cattle operations. And where bison couldn't expand, the predator reintroduction that a healthy bison ecosystem required became harder to justify. Turner's response was to remove the argument. His foundation funded private vaccine research, working alongside scientists to develop a brucellosis inoculation program that operated outside the federal system. In New Mexico, the conflict took a sharper form. Turner's ranches there became contested ground in the Mexican gray wolf reintroduction program, placing him in direct opposition to the State Game Commission, which represented livestock interests that had fought wolf recovery for decades. The science was clear, the politics were not. Turner had rebuilt the land. He had returned the architects. By the early 2000s, Turner's bison operation had grown beyond any recognizable definition of a wildlife experiment. 16 ranches across 6 states, a combined herd of approximately 50,000 animals, 1 in 10 of every bison alive in North America. The largest private bison refuge in the world, maintained entirely outside the federal land system. Ted's Montana Grill launched with bison on the menu across 37 locations. The revenue from selling bison meat didn't compromise the conservation model, it funded it. Land maintenance, predator programs, range expansion, vaccine research, all of it underwritten by the same animal at the center of the recovery. Researchers began calling this the arithmetic shift. The American bison was hunted to functional extinction in the 19th century by commercial demand. It was being pulled back by commercial demand in the 21st. The same economic logic that had nearly destroyed the species was now inverted, sustaining it. Across 2 million acres, the model held. But the most unsettling evidence wasn't in the revenue figures or the herd counts. It was in the behavior of an animal that had never once set foot on Ted Turner's land. Pronghorn antelope can run at 55 miles per hour, sustained. Across open ground, they are the second fastest land animal on Earth, and there is nothing alive on this continent that can catch them at full speed. The animal that could have been extinct for 10,000 years, the American cheetah, lost at the end of the Pleistocene, was the only predator the pronghorn's speed was ever an answer to. It has been gone since before agriculture, before any written language, before any human memory of this landscape. The pronghorn still runs from it. That detail, more than any species count, captures what happened here. Wolves recorded within the ranch boundary, grizzly bears returning to the edges, Rio Grande cutthroat trout recolonizing stream sections without being stocked, plant diversity at double its 1989 baseline and still climbing, all of it set in motion by the removal of a fence and the return of an animal the land had been waiting for. What Turner found, and what the data now confirms, is that exhausted landscapes are not dead landscapes. They are paused ones. The biological memory of what a place is supposed to be doesn't disappear under a century of misuse. It waits. And given the right conditions, the right animal, at the right scale, with enough time, it reasserts itself with a force that no management plan could have designed. That is the question this story leaves behind. Not how many ranches could be converted, or how many bison herds could be scaled, but how many landscapes have we written off that are still holding that memory, still waiting for a chance we haven't yet given them. If that question matters to you, subscribe and join us as we continue to find the answers. These stories don't surface on their own.